Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the virtual European Union Summit. European Council members are meeting via video conference to take stock of the pandemic, preparedness for health threats, security, and relations with neighboring Northern Africa and Middle East countries. The Leaders' Summit of 27-nation bloc comes a year into the COVID-19 outbreak, as most of the EU struggle with a second wave of cases, or third wave for some. Before we loop in our panelists from both Europe and China, take a look at this.
EU leaders meet in a virtual summit with more than 33 million confirmed COVID cases in Europe and bottlenecks in the vaccine rollout. President Charles Michel chairs the video conference, which is set to discuss the pandemic on the first day. The meeting will focus on speeding up the authorization, production, and distribution of vaccines, freedom of movement and travel restrictions, and solidarity with third countries. EU member states are now facing outbreaks of more contagious coronavirus variants from Britain and South Africa. Earlier, Brussels warned 6 governments, including Germany's, about unilateral border restrictions, while tourist-dependent countries are piling on the pressure to lift travel barriers in time for summer vacations. In a bid to strengthen the EU's preparedness for health threats, leaders will first exchange views on lessons learned so far. On the second day, the NATO Secretary General will join the meeting on EU-NATO relations. EU leaders will then discuss strengthening the EU's security and defense and ways to promote EU interests on the global stage. Finally, they will discuss the EU relations with neighboring North African and Middle East countries, collectively called the Southern Neighborhood. Many tough decisions have to be made, but there are concerns how much consensus leaders from different European countries can reach at this conference.
The EU summit coming at a critical time. To talk about it, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Klaus Larris, a distinguished professor of history and international affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Brussels, Fraser Cameron, senior advisor at the European Policy Center. Last but not least, in Beijing, Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet chair professor and director of the Center for EU Studies from Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start by asking you, what about the vaccines? Will this EU summit be able to solve the problem? Mr. Cameron?
No. The heads of state and government are not in a position to solve the problem from their position. This has to be done by the bureaucrats getting in touch with the companies to ensure that the production capabilities are increased and that the vaccines are distributed across the 27 member states. So they will urge the European Commission, which frankly has no previous experience of organizing this kind of thing, to actually get moving. They were slow in signing the contracts. They were bureaucratic. And of course, way far behind the UK in terms of the distribution and the vaccination of the population. So They've got a lot of catching up to do. So the European leaders will be venting their frustration at the Commission and urging them to do more.
Well, according to the earlier plan, 70% of the adults in the European Union by mid-September, that's likely to happen or not. Professor Larris, you're originally from Germany. You have a better assessment than most of us in this part of the world.
Yeah, the situation doesn't look too good within the European Union. First, I agree there were procurement problems to actually get enough vaccines produced. Now there are distribution problems. And while some countries have speeded up their ability to actually vaccinate people, like the northern countries, Sweden, Denmark come to mind, other countries, in particular Germany, have found it much more difficult to get the needle into arms. And they are talking about, you're quite right, late September, while Denmark, for example, talks about June to get most of their population vaccinated. This is a serious problem. There also have been border closures. You know, the German border with the Czech Republic has been closed, also the border partially with Austria, and even the border partially between France and Germany has been closed to some extent.
Yeah.
These are not good developments that impacts on the single market, that impacts on commerce, and it also is an emotional problem. People are at loggerheads. They, you know, disagree with each other. So that summit is meant to unite people and make sure no one is too angry when leaving the meeting.
Well, whether that can be achieved is still a question mark. 2 days to go. But, you know, one of the things people have been talking about, Professor Wang Yiwei, you've been doing research about the European Union for long from China, is whether the countries will be correlate with one another. Another thing very important is how is going to be the relationship between the EU and the pharmaceutical companies. Earlier we saw the fight between the EU and, or members of the EU and AstraZeneca, for example. So do you think the bloc is likely to solve that problem?
Well, the two problems for the European Union in dealing with all kinds of crises, including the pandemic. First is the power of producing. The second is efficiency of distribution. Producing the vaccines, I think, is firstly you have enough money to invest and innovation. The US or UK, this is Anglo-Saxon model, is more private companies in doing so, so very efficient in doing so. And in China is a strong government power, so it's also quite efficient. The European model, so-called the social market model, lack of maybe mostly efficient in a way in doing so. Also, the European Union has 27 member states. There are multi-layer of the governance, so it's quite low efficiency in distribution of the vaccines. So the two kind of shortages are actually pressure the European Union in dealing with the pandemic crisis.
However, the Europeans, together with America, it seems that Canada as well, seems to have already nailed down most of the supplies the pharmaceutical companies could provide, Mr. Cameron, of vaccines all over the world. In fact, they are occupying the majority of the vaccines that can be delivered, and well, the 130 countries around the world have not even have a single jab. Whether the European leaders are going to discuss that at all?
Yes, I think there's a general realization, particularly as President Macron has pushed this. In shorthand terms, until everyone is vaccinated, we're not safe. And so obviously the priority within individual countries is to get their own population vaccinated. But there is an understanding that, look, when international travel is as it is today, if we are going to open borders and bring people in from Africa, America, Latin America, wherever, there is a real moral case as well as an economically efficient case of ensuring that everyone in the world gets hold of the vaccine. So this is, I think, certainly going to be on the agenda of the Council today. And the European Union has set up and contributed to a fund for the distribution of vaccines worldwide.
However, there's no timetable, there's no roadmap yet. We'll see what's going to happen, particularly, the European countries and some of the countries they've been closely related linked to, for example, Latin American countries or African countries. Professor Laris, do you think about the vaccines, there is anything across the Atlantic that can be done?
Theoretically, they could, but first of all, the Europeans want to ratchet up production of the vaccine and then, as I said, get it into people's arms. In theory, yes, they could cooperate, like exchanging the vaccines across the Atlantic, make sure that European countries have enough of the vaccine, and then help them organizationally. Whether that is really being done, that is questionable, because each country or each continent, to that extent, has to look after its own devices initially. And that also means the global solidarity regarding COVAX and regarding getting the developing world also vaccinated, that really will take second place to first inoculating and vaccinating the population of your own country. This is kind of solidarity within the European Union, maybe solidarity within the United States and across the transatlantic, but I don't think that a lot of solidarity right right now with the rest of the world exists. That
I
will
see.
come, but I think it will be a few months after everyone is vaccinated in Europe and the US. Then I think it will go well beyond the transatlantic area, but that will take at least a few months, if not longer.
Well, it seems that transatlantic ties could be quite fragile in that regard when it comes to vaccines, isn't it, Professor Wang?
Well, they share the common values, but to deal with the crisis, it's like a Titanic. The first-class people will get the ticket to take the boat to leave first. So it's that kind of scenarios
All right.
happened, and also nationalism rising.
Okay. Another thing about the travel documents, Mr. Cameron, of course, there are very different situations in European countries. The way they are doing prevention and control, how they are, taming the pandemic within their own national border, and therefore, how could anyone ask for a travel document that would be bringing access to all the national borders is a big question mark. Even the vaccines itself is also an issue because we do not even know what the vaccines could do in terms of not only helping oneself, but also helping others to prevent and control. So, Mr. Cameron, with all of these question marks, will that travel document many talk about possible?
Well, it's up for discussion. I mean, there are many difficulties. As you have said, there's a question of, do you stop somebody traveling who's been unable to get the vaccine? What happens if somebody is traveling and then also gets the COVID while traveling? There's many different issues here. So I think it's important to discuss it just now, but I don't think there's going to be a common travel passport for COVID for several months yet. I mean, we have passports, for example, like smallpox, if you're traveling to countries in Africa. So that's a sort of a model one could use. And of course, it's strong pressure, especially amongst the countries in the Mediterranean, dependent on tourism, to have this kind of passport. But it's not going to happen in the coming weeks. It will take some months, I reckon.
On the other hand, Mr. Laris, Professor, we've seen it happen in both North America and some European countries that people are too optimistic to move around once the number goes down. They went on vacation despite the government warnings. Of course, everybody should enjoy their personal freedom, but come with personal freedom, there's also personal responsibilities for the society. So, Professor Laris, how optimistic do you think the EU as a whole should be about the pandemic situation? And as a result of that, making their decisions?
That's very difficult to say because, as you know, there have been strains, the South African strain, the Brazilian strain, the British strain. They have come in addition to the original virus, and that has dawned on the European Union, and they have recognized how difficult the second wave is, and there may even be a third wave. So I don't think anyone is too optimistic, but of course no one wants to be too pessimistic either. But I actually think the so-called vaccine passport for making travel available during the summer, let's say from Germany to Greece or from France to Greece, to exploit the exploit the tourist situation in the summer and give these people and these countries like Greece a lifeline, an economic lifeline. They totally depend on tourism. So I think a vaccine passport, at least temporarily for this year, is not a bad idea. I don't think that this is the future for the next few years, that we all should have a vaccine passport forever. But we are still in the middle of the pandemic. Why not resort to emergency measures to make sure the economy is not going to collapse totally?
Well, that's exactly the point. You're still in the middle of the pandemic, and therefore whether that passport is really viable or really, bring with it the significance of opening the borders, that's a very interesting question. Having said that, though, about the vaccine, China, Professor Wang, has been providing some of the European countries, particularly small European countries, with vaccine options. We've seen that over the past few weeks, particularly. How do you think this is making an impact on these countries, and how do you think this is having an impact overall on these countries' policies vis-a-vis the EU's policies toward vaccines?
Well, it's like Deng Xiaoping said, whether the white card or the black card, the card that is the best. So I think it can do work, the need more vaccines. They can import from China, from Russia, from anyway. I think it's very important for Europeans to control the situation. It's a competition among the different economies. If we can control better, and then you can open the border, and then economic recovery. So it's very important. Of course, it's a trust. It's a trust the quality and also safety of the vaccines from China. That means I think made in China, innovation in China is increased the brand and the reputation in Europe.
So do you think, from your observation, the EU will be able to provide even those smaller countries, particularly not the rich ones, access to vaccines? Because right now we know most of the largest industrial countries have the access to most of the vaccines in the world, sometimes even a few times than their populations need.
I think it's not just buy from China. I think maybe in the made in Europe with China for the world, maybe that's a kind of scenario. For instance, recently Austria can be provided some factories and relocated with Chinese vaccines and then distribute to other European countries. I think that kind of model can increase definitely the collaboration between China and Europe.
Very interesting, because the patent is a very important issue for the pharmaceutical companies. Certainly China is taking a different approach, trying to provide more technical support. We'll see how that works. Mr. Cameron, how do you see that approach? What does that mean for the EU's overall policy about vaccine access and also vaccination of its population?
Well, they don't have much experience, and that's why the European Council will probably today ask the Commission to produce a report by June, their next scheduled meeting, on the whole range of issues covering supply chains, covering how you increase storage, production capabilities, etc. Also the international dimension of this. So I think, we're struggling at the moment simply to get production in Europe up, but this is not a Europe problem or an American problem, it's a global problem. And hence it's important to involve the WHO to work towards a sort of a new pandemic threat assessment, because there are new variants arising. And so everyone has to be involved in this. This is not an issue that one country or one continent can solve on its own.
Having said that, though, there's another element to the EU virtual summit that is about security. Professor Laris, we've seen very interesting phenomenon that the EU not only talk about, working together with the NATO, but also trying to emphasize the EU should have its own identity and also should have its own correlations of defense and national security policies. Professor Laris, your take. How much can be achieved this time? What's likely to be the real focus?
Yeah, this is actually an old issue. Already when you go back to the 1950s, they tried to set up something like a European defense community, which failed then. And then from the late 1990s onwards, they had the ambition to develop a European defense policy. And of course, something like a European foreign and defense policy does exist, but it's very rudimentary and it needs to be strengthened. And the European Union would like to have its own maritime forces, for example, basically a permanent navy which can be used around the territory of the European Union. And they want to strengthen that, and that ambition is probably a sensible one, so that they don't have to rely on NATO in all sorts of emergencies, or when perhaps the NATO majority doesn't want to get involved, but the European Union feels that there is an issue, they should really have their own defense forces available. So that will be discussed. I can't see that tomorrow, when they will discuss it, that an awful lot of progress will be made. But it has been on the agenda for a long time and will probably continue to be on the agenda.
Mr. Cameron, very different circumstances, though, compared to 1950s, 1990s. It was during the Cold War, after the Cold War, and now it's a very different geopolitical situation, very different America.
Indeed, but in this new context, I think there's 2 or 3 points to add. I mean, firstly, tomorrow they're looking at hybrid threats, cybersecurity. So that's, quite changed from several years ago. Secondly, they're looking at the neighborhood. How can one contribute more to security in North Africa and the Sahel? This is something the Biden administration wants Europe to do. So I think you'll see positive signs from across the Atlantic. And thirdly, again, Biden will not give up on asking Europeans to do more. So I think while everyone is relieved that Trump is no longer in the White House, they want to demonstrate to the new administration in Washington that they are capable of doing more. Hence, they will be taking decisions to actually increase their own expenditure to develop their capabilities. But this will not be at the detriment of NATO. This will be to do new security measures in and around the European Union, peacekeeping operations in the Balkans, for example.
Professor Wang, how do you look at all of these possible changes and at least discussions about the possible changes?
Well, I think the Europeans and the NATO's also New Deal, traditional and non-traditional security issues that they need to cooperate because 22 European Union's members, also the NATO members, so want to save the energy and then also to coordinate with NATO. And the NATO also seeks the transformation for the legitimacy. So non-traditional security issues also the NATO's concern. So need to do more.
But there's always an interesting issue about where the EU is, isn't it? In this geopolitical whatever competition or slash rivalry slash cooperation between China and the United States. So, Professor Wang, how do you see the EU is trying to shape it from their perspective?
Well, they have the definition of so-called geopolitics European Commission. That means it's a more independent player, not just a blame player field of the China and the U.S. rival. So they seek the strategic autonomy, not just from China and also from the United States.
Very interesting discussion. We'll see how the meeting will bring out some temporary result. For now, I want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, joining us, Fraser Cameron, Klaus Larrys, and Wang Yiwei. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen.